I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. Today on Hard Knocks, I interview Andrea Werhun, who is the author of Modern Whore and also the co-creator of the Modern Whore documentary, which is an adaptation of her hybrid memoir and photo book about her life as a sex worker. Fascinating conversation because, of course, I think as all of us, we have certain ideas and expectations about the sex worker industry and what it means and how moral it is and all of it. And I think the thing that was most compelling about speaking with Andrea and her work is how it really asked me to press pause on my feelings and intuitions and to go back to my base philosophical principles and ask myself, what is the difference, if any, between sex work and regular work? And also to just, the film that is making the circuit right now, Modern Whore, is a hoot to watch. It's wild, it's stylized, it's comedic, it's whimsical, it's itself is a great film. So I recommend people watch it. But in the meantime, please enjoy this conversation where me and Andrea talk about sex work, what criminalization does to it, what introducing labor laws to it would look like, and how we grapple with all the weird feelings we feel about it and whether or not those are justified. Excited to speak with you, Andrea. Thank you so much for coming on Hard Knocks.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes. Okay, so I just got done watching the documentary. What a tour of force. It is just visually beautiful, extremely compelling. Blah. Is that just a perfect recreation of your memoir? How did the turning of it into a documentary take place?
Yeah, I would say that it is a pretty good visual representation of the book, which in and of itself is both a combination of stories and a visual element, because it's got photography taken by Nicole Bazine, who's also the director of the feature film. And so I read a review where someone said it's not quite an adaptation of the book. It's more an adaptation of the experience of reading the book.
Ah, okay, awesome.
So it is really meant to feel like a storybook come to life.
Got it, yes. Tell me about that relationship with your co-author and the director. How did you come about meeting each other and putting together this memoir, picture book, documentary? Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah, so Nicole Bazine and I, we met on the set of a music video shoot that she was directing more than a decade ago. I showed up on set to play a go-go dancer in the music video, and she informed me that because the other go-go dancer hadn't shown up, that she was going to be the other go-go dancer with me while also directing. And so we got glammed up together in the washroom getting ready for the shoot, and it's spawned a creative friendship that's continued to this day. And over the years, I had been escorting in my early 20s and making art, and then I stopped escorting. I went to work on a farm, and Nicole came to visit me. And when she was there, I was regaling her with stories from my previous working life. And she said, you know what, we have to make something together. Let's do something. And so we eventually settled on creating this sex work art book memoir. So I wrote the stories based on my experiences, and Nicole took photos of me, and it became the project known as Modern Whore. And we self-published this book, and we raised $20,000 over Kickstarter and printed 1,000 copies, and eventually they sold out. And by 2022, Penguin Random House picked it up for an engorged, as we like to put it, second edition that included not just my escorting experiences from my early 20s, but my later strip club experiences from my later 20s. And from there, we made short films together based on our work. And now we've got this feature hybrid documentary that's out there in the world.
Yeah. Okay. So I've never seen a documentary like this. I thought it was just so ingenious the way that you guys did this. It's obviously really highly stylized recreation, often to comedic effect. And I wanted to ask, how does that layer of performance contribute to what you hope is the audience's understanding and appreciation of your experience?
Yeah, I think humor is a really important part of storytelling. And also, I think the quickest gateway into people's hearts. And when it comes to sex work, I think the narrative of us all being these disempowered victims is sort of the usual gateway into storytelling and the stories that people hear about us and the stories that we see in TV and film is just this eternal victimhood. And what people don't get to see is our humanity. And I think humor plays a really big role in that. I think often about something I've heard Sean Baker say, which is if there's no humor, it's not human. And so I think humor is a really important part of the humanization process, which is, ultimately the goal of sex worker storytelling, which is that I need people to understand that I'm a human being and just like all of my other colleagues in this industry, we are human beings who are worthy of love, respect, dignity, and equal rights. And if we are harmed on the job, we deserve to have equal access to justice, just like everybody else. If our only stories in the public relate to our victimhood, it perpetuates a story that we are all victims and that our victimhood is inherent to our labor. And that's simply not the case. We are human beings first and foremost, and we deserve to be protected just like everybody else.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk to you about that, especially because, as you may or may not know, I've had my own experience with being vilified through my sexuality and, being called a femme fatale. And I think that I found your story to be really, really relatable just as a young woman in the world, particularly when I don't think people fully understand how common it is just in the cultural fabric for people to be for young women to be sexually commodified, whether they're sex workers or not. and I'm thinking even about how your story could so easily have been mine, because back when I was in college, so you were in college, this became an opportunity for you that was better than the minimum wage grind. And I was in college, I was working 3 different jobs and, minimum wage jobs. And I remember going to a video store and, just checking out the little X-rated section just because I was curious to see what they had. I didn't have any experience at all, even watching porn. I was really in the dark. So I was just curious, and I went in there, and basically the second I crossed the threshold into this little room that was for the X-rated material, the guy who worked at this video store swooped in and was like, "Hey, I'm thinking about filming a softcore thing." He's just and it was like, "Would you be interested in filming a softcore thing?" And I was just like, and he was like, "It'd be $2,000. All you have to do is take a shower." And it's like, if you're wagging $2,000 in front of a college student who works 3 different jobs at minimum wage, and you're telling her all you have to do is take a shower, that, it certainly crossed my mind to accept the offer. And, to this day, I wonder about how my life would have been completely different had I taken him up on the offer. And one part of me is thinking, oh my God, my whole experience in Italy would have been completely even more of a disaster than it was, because, again, of the stigma of being a young person who, like, even if it was just a shower video, like the idea of me being somebody who had done porn would have just, like, I think I would not be here today. Thoughts.
Certainly, the compounding quality of sexual stigma when it comes to women and it comes to sex work. Whoo, yeah, it probably would have been extra brutal, right? Because, it's hard enough for women to be taken seriously when it comes to any type of sexual indiscretion or violence perpetrated against us, regular civilian women. But you add sex work to the equation and suddenly we're asking for it. It's still okay to assume that sex workers are asking for it. Civilian women have been cleared thanks to Me Too. We know that no woman is ever asking for it, but sex workers still, unfortunately, because we accept remuneration for our labor, somehow rape is an acceptable occupational hazard, and that's deeply unfortunate. And yeah, I agree with you. I think that your experience would have been worse, stigma wise. I think about like bimbos, for instance, famous bimbos of recent memory, Anna Nicole Smith, even Pamela Anderson, who's been able to sort of transform from a bimbo whose sex tape was exploited without her consent and without any of her remuneration, and she's been able to sort of reform her image into someone who like everybody loves. But there was a period where people didn't love her. Famous sex working bimbos tend to be punished eventually, and even if they're loved. And so it's just a layer of misogyny and whorephobia and sexism that makes it difficult for women to be ourselves in public, unfortunately. And as soon as you get the criminal justice system involved, I think that those laws have just simply not kept a pace of women's liberation in any way. When I think about how do we, if we're sexually assaulted, and even just as a civilian, if a civilian is sexually assaulted, what are the chances that that person who's perpetrated violence against her is actually going to be brought to justice? The chances are very low. So I don't know. I think about vigilante justice a lot, actually.
Oh no, is that the next stage of your transformation?
Gee, I hope not. But if it must be, shall it be?
I mean, you have costumes behind you, so I mean, I think the thing that's coming to mind, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on this, is just the idea, not just that sex workers are asking for it and are not considered victims of sexual violence the way that civilian women are, but also this idea that sexually, I'm thinking about how the idea of me being called a whore at the time, even if I'm not a professional whore, but just a sexually active young woman, means that people can project the idea that if I'm capable of that, if I'm capable of promiscuity, I must be capable of anything. Right? Like that idea that just because, and so I'm wondering if that's even more elevated. And I didn't feel like this was something that was totally touched upon in your documentary that I saw, which is that idea, the stigma that if you are capable of sex work, you are capable of committing any kind of crime. And so no one should ever, you are sort of guilty by default.
Yes. Yeah. I think sex workers in public consciousness, are either victims or villains, which is something we do touch upon, but you're right. We don't go super deep into that idea, but I think a sex worker villain is usually a femme fatale. Her whole function is to use her sexual wiles, her beauty, her powers of seduction to harm men. And that's why in the film we do put some time and effort into this new sort of contrasting archetype of femininity, called the femme fatale. Who is a woman who can be sexually liberated, be sexy, be beautiful, be talented, be outspoken, be independent, talented, creative, and not punished, and also do what she can do to support her community and be a contributor, a meaningful contributor to society. When I think about the femme fatale, I think about someone like Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton has never had to mute herself or desexualize herself. She's always been sexy, but she gets to be fully herself. And so few of us actually in the real world get that opportunity as women to be, buxom, brilliant, beautiful, fully realized humans, because of this assumption that if you are beautiful, you are using that beauty to get something. And how dare we? And then and I agree with you in the sense that, like, the word whore is not an insult hurled exclusively at sex workers.
Right.
It is something that is projected onto any feminized person who dares to step out of line, who is behaving outside the bounds of conventional femininity and sexuality. When we as women do what we want, speak our minds, are honest and true to ourselves, we're acting like whores.
So I think that the thing that I came away with just being sort of shocked into, like, I had a wow moment, not to repeat the wow moment of that reviewer. I'm getting into like little like details of the documentary that are just like so freaking funny. There's a review that is written about Andrea as a worker, that is titled "Wow." But my own wow moment was just that going from femme fatale to femme vitale. This idea that a woman could provide a vital, life-affirming service. Like, instead of viewing it as a woman using feminine wiles to do some kind of illicit, thing to be harmful, that sexuality could be interpreted, especially like what feminized people can provide to a sexual encounter, as like a life-affirming service. And I love that you bring Dolly Parton as an example of that, because I think you're right. Like, I think she's generally always been sexualized, but at the same time, she's been respected as a artist and a creator and somebody who is like a deep contributor to her community and to her society. And somehow she managed to do both. I'm not sure how. Maybe it was because there's this element of sweetness to her that makes it palatable. I'm not entirely there's almost like this idea that she's almost but she's not innocent to the fact that, she's buxom. So like that, it's just fascinating to me that like Dolly Parton was able to somehow pull this off and like nobody else. I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but the one thing that I got me thinking about was I was trying, because I will admit that going into this documentary, I too had some feelings and like intuitive feelings about how sexual labor is qualitatively different than other kinds of labor. And I didn't, philosophically, I couldn't quite put my finger on why I felt that way. And I was trying to sort of wrap my mind around, is this just like a culturally instilled horophobia reaction where there's this part of me that is I don't know, there's just something like it's emotional and physical intimacy that is very specific. And but is that different? There are lots of kinds of labor that involve emotional intimacy, therapy, for example. We when we enter into a contract with a therapist, like, we are divulging our most intimate secrets. They are responding as a deep listener and as a compassionate, advisor. People fall in love with their therapists, so it's not like this is unique to the sex worker industry. And on the flip side, like, a masseuse is very physically intimate with a person. There is a kind of emotional distance because the expectation is you're not really talking to each other. You're just like, receiving the physical, benefits of this intimate contact. And like, I was trying to imagine what the closest thing I could think of to this is of an example, a modern day example of a femme fatale that actually exists, that isn't stigmatized. And the closest thing I could think of, and maybe this is just because this is the stage of life that I'm at right now, is an au pair. So someone who lives in your home, who is there to basically be a substitute mom, like, who is there to, like, provide the emotional and physical support to children that normally a mother would provide, but I'm a working mom and I can't do it 24 hours a day. So, like, it seemed to me like that was the closest comparison I could come to when it came to the idea of, like, a physical and emotional, like, a very intimate service that is feminized, that is provided, that does not receive the kind of stigma that sex work does. Is that like an even close, fair comparison? Does that resonate at all?
I think it's a fair comparison, only except that it doesn't involve any sexuality whatsoever.
Right.
Minus that part, yes.
Yes, right, great. So then it got me thinking, like, okay, well, is there anything that's qualitatively different about that kind of work versus sex work? And I mean, your argument, let's walk through your argument, which is there isn't. Is that correct? Or no?
So I think what makes sex work different than other industries in which there are, in which there is intimacy, in which there's pleasure, and even industries separate from those that involve physical labor and even proximity to risk, physical risk, is that in contrast to those industries, sex work is criminalized. And that plays a huge role in how the labor is done and how the labor is respected, and who gets to do it safely, and what the implications are for everybody involved.
Sure.
It's a criminalized form of labor. And when people talk about the inherent risks or dangers with sex work, there is no inherent danger in exchanging sexuality for money. But there is an inherent danger and risk that is imposed upon the industry by laws and policies that make it impossible for sex workers to access justice.
Right. And I'm totally on board with that argument. And actually, you know what? We should just discuss the argument so that anyone who's not on board with the argument, because to me that seemed like, as I was watching the show, I'm philosophically at a place where I'm like, well, then obviously the criminalization of it is going to make that, like, inherently more risky. Just like any other service industry job, if it is criminalized, it's going to make it more risky. It's going to make you more susceptible to human trafficking. It's going to make you more susceptible to, not being actually remunerated for your work, to slavery, basically, to people who are taken advantage. So let's talk about how criminalization has made. What is it about the criminalization of the industry that makes it inherently more coercive? Like, it's not inherently more coercive and exploitative than other forms of labor, in my opinion. But what is it about criminalization that makes it, that puts it in a position of suddenly becoming coercive and exploitative?
So when our work is governed by criminal law and not labor law, it means we don't have access to occupational health and safety. Our work is not legitimized. It's not considered real work. We don't have the ability to effectively organize and unionize and fight for better labor rights. Under criminalization, we don't have access to the same rights as other workers. And that plays a massive role in how the job gets done and how sex workers are treated. I'm in Canada, and so the conditions for engaging in sex work are a little different than in most of the United States, where
Okay.
sex work is fully criminalized. There are little pockets of the United States, like Nevada, where sex work is legalized. In the Canadian context, we have what is called the Nordic model, which purports that all sex workers are victims and all clients, all people who pay for sexual services, are essentially violent offenders. And it criminalizes the client under the guise that sex workers should be able to go to the police if something happens to them. That technically being a sex worker is not criminalized. However, in Canada, the laws are very twisted, which means that, sex workers aren't allowed to advertise. We're not allowed to have essentially conversations with our customers about what we allow and what we don't allow. We're not allowed to hire security. And we're not allowed to work together indoors. We're also not allowed to work outside. But technically, it is legal for us to accept the money for the sexual service. But otherwise, it's impossible to actually engage in sex work legally. And so in that context, the Nordic model, which is, in place in lots of places around the world, it has the same impact as fully criminalizing our labor. It doesn't actually keep us safe, and it in fact continues to perpetuate our victimhood to be legally defined as victims. In the United States, where it's mostly fully criminalized, sex workers run the risk of being arrested, going to jail for engaging in this form of labor, as do the clientele, but usually it's the sex worker who faces that reality. Depending on the type of sex work you're doing, people who work in massage parlors who are, oftentimes racialized immigrants. We know what the context is in the United States right now against people of color, especially sex workers who are in vulnerable positions. There's a lot of exploitation that can happen in a criminalized context. Whereas if the work is decriminalized, sex workers actually have the ability to go to the cops if something actually happens without being worried that they're going to be arrested themselves when something happens to them. And we can look to New Zealand as our shining beacon of light, because they've had sex work decriminalized nationally for over 20 years now. And they're an excellent case study. I think often of one particular case where a woman who worked at a brothel was being sexually harassed by her boss. And so she took him to the Human Rights Tribunal there, because nobody should be sexually harassed in the workplace, period. And she won that case. She won that case in New Zealand because sex work is considered real work, and sexual harassment in the workplace shouldn't happen whether or not sexual activity takes place in your workplace.
Yeah, I've read about this. I had no idea that New Zealand was this shining example of what legalized sex work could look like, and ultimately, what it amounts to is it appears like any other service industry job, right? Like the reality, like the experience of it for both provider and consumer alike is that it is like any other service industry job. That, boundaries are negotiated, that there are contracts, that trafficking is a lot easier to detect. Workers have increased agency, like that idea that only people who are desperate and have no other recourse are not going to necessarily just go into this work. Violence decreases. Like there's a lot of healthy, happy things that result from people being able to resort to labor laws as a as part of that work. And so that's like, I had no idea that that was true. And I think it's really interesting to see New Zealand as an example of this. Like that's a really great example. And I think that it is true that, well, actually, I'm curious, how did New Zealand get there? Like, how did they arrive at surpassing the social stigma to the extent that they could not only like, they could go beyond the Nordic model, which views sex workers as only coerced and exploited victims?
They got there because they worked with sex workers to develop a bill that would decriminalize sex work. The New Zealand Prostitutes Collective wrote the bill and worked with politicians to get them on board, essentially, and to advocate for this bill. And it was close. It wasn't like a majority of the politicians in New Zealand were 100% for this bill. But it was written by sex workers, and it was pushed through by advocates for our safety who had been elected. And it was able to pass. I know that there were certain sacrifices and provisions that were added sort of last minute that guaranteed its passage that I know that a lot of sex workers are not happy about in New Zealand.
Like what?
There is a provision that excludes migrant sex workers from the benefits of this bill. So sex work is decriminalized for citizens, but it's not decriminalized for people who may enter the country and engage in sex work, which makes it very, I mean, it's a racist provision, essentially. And it leaves migrant sex workers vulnerable to deportation and to exploitation and to violence. All the things that, criminalization does for sex workers everywhere around the world. Unfortunately, migrant sex workers are still being impacted by under the decriminalization model in New Zealand.
What was the reasoning behind that?
Anti-immigrant fervor that's rising everywhere around the world in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
Yeah.
There were some times in the documentary where I had, like, even with the humor of it all, I had moments of doubt. Can I tell you, like, the one that really stuck with me? Because, like, actually there were a lot of moments, and especially in these, like, recreations of your experiences, where I was like, oh, that's nice. Like, oh, here I'm, like, seeing this, like, femme fatale, like, in action. Like, it makes sense. Like, oh, of course this of course this is, this person who has a disability and is therefore, not getting dates all the time is, like, finding validation, and, like, there's this great, like, perfect harmony, like, yay, everyone's happy kind of vibe. And then there was the depiction of the lazy bachelor. So you talk about, like, there are some patterns to the kinds of clients that you see. There's, like, the traveler, or the guy who, the married man who is not, wanting to have an affair, and so instead he's having a fling, like a professional fling, and there's people who are disabled, but then there's the lazy bachelor. And watching, like, even a humorous depiction of watching you gag on the grossness of this guy put me in doubt. Like, I know at the end there's this sort of, like, you get the job done and you're victorious and you're like, yay, touchdown, did it, like, did it, but, like, at the same time, I'm just trying to imagine that stripped away of the humor and just how gross and cringy the experience was. And is that also an inherent part of the work? And does that make it like, yes, there are gross and cringy parts of other forms of labor jobs, but is there something just like qualitatively different about that? Thoughts?
Yeah, so that scene is based on a story in the book called Go Leaves Go, and it is just as gross as it is depicted on screen. I think this is again where like sex worker humor comes in to deal with some of the more disturbing parts of our jobs, which is the absence of male hygiene in certain sexual situations. And I think what's more disturbing is when you're new to the industry and you're young,
Yeah.
and you need the money, and you're not quite sure how to say no yet. You haven't established boundaries. You're not sure what the standards are. You don't know how to broach the subject that this client who has paid you money is expecting you to, put his anatomy in your orifices, and he smells horrible. At the time I was like, this man has paid me to love him for an hour, so I don't know how to tell him this. Of course, when I told that story to other sex workers after the fact, I learned very quickly that it is a standard, and it is, a mandatory protocol for most sex workers to have their clients take a shower before they're intimate, for instance. But I didn't know that at the time, because there's no training manual. Nobody teaches you these things.
Right.
And
Part
there
of
is
the whole
something-
labor law situation, the orientation.
Would have loved an orientation. But yeah, we don't have access to that. And to be frank, it's a health and safety issue to be in close contact with customers that don't clean their cracks, So yeah, there is something sad and disturbing and gross about that. And I think that is where the humor comes in, because it's kind of, in a lot of ways, the only way to effectively
Yeah.
deal with the aftermath of those types of situations. And it's kind of, a bit of, it's, when I wrote the story, it did feel like a bit of a hit back at that situation. It was a bit of revenge. It was like, okay, well, you violated me in this way, so I'm going to tell this story for a laugh now, and like try to get as many laughs as possible to kind of like redeem myself in this situation. But yeah, it is sad, because when you're desperate for money, you lose the ability to say no. And that is very sad. As far as the doubt that you feel in watching the film. And I'm not trying to make an argument that sex work is empowering, even. All I'm trying to argue is that sex work is a job, and that we deserve access to labor rights, and that we should be treated as equals.
Yeah.
And I don't think work is empowering in general. I think we could have like a conversation about what it means to.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it gets down to, right? Like, is any work empowering in general? Are we all slaves to needing to provide for ourselves? And is anyone making a rational calculus at any moment about what is the best, like, what is the most effective way to make the most money in the shortest amount of time? Like, that all makes sense to me. And so, like, for the record, I'm on the same page with you that, like, it totally, like, that's where the 19-year-old me who's thinking back to that, video store guy, and how, like, waving $2,000 at a college student who's in debt is compelling or coercive, however you want to think about it. Obviously, he didn't force me to do anything because I didn't do it. But money itself is coercive, is exploitative. So if we're going to just accept that that is the reality that all of us are in, now let's talk about how do we fairly protect people who are doing what they can to make the most money in the least amount of time in ways that don't hurt people. Okay, great.
Agreed. Totally,
Agreed.
totally
Okay,
agree.
that makes sense. Um,
But yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be a fulsome story or a fulsome film, a fulsome book if it didn't look at some of the grosser parts of the job.
sure.
It's a body job, right? Like
Yeah.
we come into contact with, the body, in various aspects and iterations of sexual labor. And
Hmm.
it's important to talk about that. It's gross and it's funny and it's weird and disturbing and it's real.
Yeah. And again, like a lot of the issues that you bring up in the documentary about like what can go wrong, again, are often the result of, well, this is going wrong because I don't have labor laws, right? Like this is like my escort, service provider person is not telling me the full truth about my situation, or is not letting me get into contact with other workers so that I can compare notes. And like all of these things are a result of are coming up because of the criminalization aspect, not because it's an inherent danger of the work itself. Agreed. And so now I want to get into the part where we can maybe try to like figure out, because this is the thing that I'm still trying to figure out. Is there something qualitatively different besides the fact that like qualitatively different, not the way that it's treated, but just like inherently, is there something different about sex work? Because I can't put my finger on it. And it seems to me like if you really dig deep into it, where do you find it? And yet so many people feel so strongly that there is something qualitatively different. And so I'm trying to like work through that. And I imagine you have thought deeply about this way longer and harder than I have. So like putting yourselves in the shoes of people who are saying that there is something sacred about sex, that there is something that like the argument that you can't, like, as opposed to other forms of labor, like other forms of service where you choose to make a meal, like you choose to cook a meal for someone, or you choose to cut their flowers for them. Sex requires a kind of bodily response, like two bodies are having to respond to each other. And is it possible to perform that, or does it need to be real, like, for it to work? Like, ugh. Do you know what I'm like trying to ask? Like, like some people say you can't fake the performance, and you're arguing this is performance. Like, would you just push back and say no, it's totally, like, you can totally, if you're a professional performer of this kind, you can turn your body on in the ways that it needs to be on in order to perform this service?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we clock in for work, we don't necessarily want to be there, but we do what we need to do to get through the shift.
Yeah.
I don't do full service escorting anymore, but I do work at a strip club.
Yeah.
Do I have to be there when I'm PMSing? When I'm on my period? Am I
Yeah.
doing everything I can to hide my tampon string? Like, yeah, I am actually. And I have to be there because I gotta work. Girls gotta eat.
Yeah.
It's a tough question. I think like if you ask different sex workers,
Mm.
you're gonna get different answers.
Hmm.
I'm very much on the side of like it's a job. And what makes sex work different than other jobs is the stigma. It's the way that we're treated
Hmm.
by people outside of the industry. It's the
Mm-hmm.
perception, it's the risks, it's the stakes of being a sex worker that are so different from other jobs. There's very few jobs you can have where if you told your family that you did it, they would excommunicate you from the family.
Sure.
There's very few jobs where if your landlord found out, they would evict you.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it came up in a divorce proceeding, your partner, ex-partner could get full custody of your children. Or you could have your children taken away. What
Mm-hmm.
other jobs are there where the stakes are that high, where you could lose
Mm-hmm.
your children, your housing, your family, your relationships, your prospects romantically?
Mm-hmm.
Other jobs, you know, I think that's what makes sex work different is the social reality of the way that it impacts our relationships to other people. At the end of the day, as someone who has done this type of labor for many, many years, I frankly, no disrespect to my clientele, but I clock in and I clock out.
Mm.
And while I do know and have experienced the reality that you develop pretty close bonds with the people that are paying you for your time,
Mm-hmm.
who have paid for the privilege of accessing you in a deeply personal way.
Mm.
Those are deep bonds, and often they are years long, decades long, lifelong bonds that you have with people in the same way, like you were mentioning earlier about therapists,
Mm-hmm.
massage therapists, people who have the ability to make you feel good.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy when you have the means to pay to keep those people in your life
Mm-hmm.
because they contribute to your life in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be inaccurate to say that those relationships are meaningless without the money. Of course, they have meaning. We're human beings. But the money is a very important part, and we
Mm-hmm.
can never take the work, the labor, the job part out of the conversation when it comes to sex work.
Right. I mean, this is where it seems like such an obvious comparison to au pairing to me because, like, and again, sorry, I have an au pair and I have two young children, and I am around a lot of families that have au pairs, and there's like ask any of them and they'll say it's like this person has become a member of our family. They are in our home. They are like, a part of our daily routine now. They have like emotional bonds, like physical and emotional bonds to our children, our most intimate like people in our lives. But we're paying them. Like they're here because we're paying them to be here. Like it's not like if one day we decided, and also there are rules. Like she can only work for 10 hours at a time and can't work more than that and has to have this many hours off and like has to be able to have access to like education and a vehicle. Like there's just like all of these rules that don't make it any less like intimate and personal, but still it's a job. Like it, so like for me it seems, and again maybe it's just because I have an au pair in my life that it seems like those distinctions are obvious to me, and like a lot of people push back and say, well, I mean, I've literally like spent the entire, ever since watching the documentary, I've spent like all of the time looking up what are the arguments against it. Like, what are the arguments against it? Let's get into it. Okay, sex involves access to the body. Okay, well, other jobs do too. Masseuses have access to the body, nurses have access to the body, doctors have access to the body. Why is it? Well, is it because it's access to your body? Like, is that why it's different? Why, like,
I mean, like you're saying, there's so many exceptions to that rule, and which suggests it's not really a rule intended to protect sex workers. It's an attempt to control women's bodies and what we do with our sexuality outside of the traditional bounds of monogamy and marriage.
right. The other one is that it's in like some people argue that you can't divorce sex from love. That like it's inherently a part of a relationship. Thoughts?
Wrong.
Okay.
um, yes, of course you can separate sex with love, but I don't know. I guess I have a more nuanced relationship with love and with sex maybe than the average person as far as like my own reflections on it.
Mm-hmm.
I think between sex and love is care. And you can care. You can care about someone you're having sex with. And I think people are happy to pay to be cared for.
And I mean, that to me is how it's, again, very similar to au pairing, where it's like, I'm not expecting my au pair to love my kids as much as I love my kids, but I expect them to care about them. And like, and my au pair, like my au pairs do deeply care about my kids. Like there is a very like loving, affectionate relationship with them that doesn't at all diminish my relationship with them. So it's just like, again, sorry, like every time I keep trying to like poke holes in it, I'm like, but that's what my au pair does.
I love that. I
like
love that connection. I love it because I think you're right. I think when you have a relationship with someone who, is paid to be there, but paid to care, this is emotional labor. It's paid emotional labor. And that's a huge part of what sex workers do that doesn't get recognized when we talk about sex work. I think when people imagine sex work, they think about people whose job is like strictly sexual activity, when they don't consider the fact that so much of the work is not only emotional labor, but a lot of administrative labor. Well, there's so many other tasks that go beyond, the 15 minutes of P&V sex that usually takes place.
Right. Well, I'm even like imagining, I'm wondering if one of the reasons why it is stigmatized is because people, like one of the ways that they try to delegitimize it is say it's just P&V. But actually one of the things that scares people about it is the fact that it is emotional labor. And it's emotional labor that we feel like should be reserved for a very specific context. And
or performed for free.
Right. Like this is, yeah, exactly. Like this is something that we should expect from certain people in our lives and no one else. And
Yeah.
but again, like that's where I'm like, but like I do not feel threatened by my au pair in the sense that I'm not jealous of the affection that my children feel for my au pair. I mean, I might if like suddenly my children didn't want me to hold them anymore, and then I'd be like, oh no, that means that I'm not providing them that emotional service that I should be providing them if I want them to reciprocate those feelings for me. But like that's like again, it just made me wonder if like maybe one of the reasons why sex work is so stigmatized is because people know that like men are like, again, because I'm a mom of a toddler, for me now I've just decided that everyone's a toddler, especially men. And like they getting, and they need this sort of like femme fatale energy for them to like be able to just function. And like I am aware that like I am providing a femme fatale service to my children, to my husband. Like that's really apparent. Like that's the sort of vibe that I came away from watching your documentary. Is it's like, in a way, I am a sex worker, like in the sense that I am doing it for free for my family. And I'm wondering if like, because we tend to associate that kind of labor to women, to mothers, to wives, to girlfriends, that is there something like, is that threat to the family structure the thing that people are actually afraid of?
I think in large part, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, and I love hearing your thoughts on the femme fatale and connecting that to yourself and your experience as a mother and the type of energy that you're being expected to bring to the table as a mother.
And then I'm happy to, like, I feel fulfilled doing it, but like, yeah, like
it's still labor.
That's the labor, and like at the end of the day, especially when you're like, I think, and this is something where I think a lot of mothers of young children will resonate, is it's like at the end of a day, of like having your kids crawling all over you and being like, mommy, 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 and your husband's wanting to crawl all over you. You're just like, I am done. I am spent. I am out. Like, I just need to pass out. It's labor. You are so tired. And it's labor that like we're expected to want to give and to tirelessly give and to have endless reserves of.
And then I'm sure on occasion you think about the boundaries that your au pair has.
Yeah.
Working 10 hours a day, I mean, that sounds pretty nice.
Yeah.
Right? You
Right.
know, like, and I think that's also part of the threat of sex workers who speak up about their experiences and gain more power and talk about what the work is actually like, is that what we bring to the fore is that our interactions with most men is very boundaried. The moment a sex worker crosses that line into sex work, a woman crosses that line into sex work, she realizes how much of her time and access to herself as a person and access to her body has been stolen from her.
Huh.
It's actually wage theft.
Wow.
To be a woman and to not be paid, to be accessed by men. That once you boundary yourself and your value and you put a price tag on it, it's a total game changer. Because you realize how many people have been trying to get access to you for free when they don't give you anything in return.
Is that your counter argument to those who say that sex work is just a symptom of patriarchy and that it's like perpetuating bad male, like toxic male behavior?
Yes. But I would say that whorephobia and hating whores specifically, beyond, your run-of-the-mill misogyny, is the cornerstone of the patriarchy. So when radical feminists rally against sex workers, all I see are people who are totally patriarchy pilled. There's nothing modern about hating sex workers. Like, it's been thousands of years of patriarchy that's taught us to hate whores, to hate women who operate independently and can financially survive on our own without men, without a marriage, without a husband, without someone telling us what to do. The way that sex work is framed in that anti-sex work context as something that disempowers us and limits us is totally outside of the lived experience of most sex workers who are able to make their own way on their own terms, set their own rates, work when they want, and do what they want to do with their own lives. So, yeah, I this idea that sex work, sex workers pander to the male gaze and it's all about men. We're getting paid. We're okay.
Do you think that there's anything to the argument of how you're getting paid to pander to the the male gaze? But then does that set like the male gaze's expectation to all women should be pandering to the male gaze, and so anyone who's not like I think what I'm trying to figure out is like, is there, by offering the service and being willing to represent and fulfill the fantasy of these male clients, is that in any way impacting their relationships and understandings of civilian women that they may encounter? Do you think that they're like, everyone's smart enough to realize that there's a difference between a sex worker who's getting paid to do it and a civilian who's not?
I think we live in a culture that still hates women, period. And I'm not sure what it matters, what we do to reform men. I don't really care about men. Like, I don't care about the male gaze. Like I put on my makeup and, put on my lashes, put on my little outfit, and I go to the strip club and I do my little hyper femme performance and I get paid for it. And then I go home and I live my life. I don't think that sex workers are a threat to civilian women. And that framing, that somehow our beauty and our creativity and our skills and our talents and our intelligence is a threat to civilian women and really just sets an unrealistic expectation because men like us more than they like regular women. Like, I don't know. It's just like, I guess I just find it all fairly ridiculous. And in the end, the only real losers in that scenario and in that framing are women.
Yeah. And in practice, you haven't seen that to be the case.
No, and it sort of reminds me of arguments like porn is making men more violent. Men are violent. They don't need porn to be violent. There's a lot of men who hate women. And we live in a society that rewards men for being violent against women. And it has nothing to do with porn. It has nothing to do with sex work. It has nothing to do with sex workers. We live in a society that makes it impossible for anyone to successfully get justice for being sexually assaulted, for instance. It's just the reality of living in a misogynist and horophobic and sexist society. It doesn't matter what we do. Men are gonna men. So we should at least try to keep each other safe and keep sex workers safe by giving us labor rights.
Right. Let's see. Are there any other things that I've been looking up that are like, oh, you know what? Actually, there's this one I did want to ask about. That the consequences of harm are different. So, and again, like, I'm not sure how much I'm on board with this argument because there are jobs out there that are extremely dangerous, right? Like, there are people who have to deal with power lines, high voltage, there are jobs where people literally risk their lives to do that job. And so the argument that sex work is inherently more dangerous than other work, I'm not sure that I buy, but what is your response to that?
I don't buy it either, but I will never be here saying sex work there's no risks at all with sex work. No, like, we're in close proximity with, people's bodies. And yes, sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, theft, kidnapping, murder. These are all risks. These are all risks of our work.
That's elevated because it's criminalized and not
Exactly.
because there aren't labor laws to protect and facilitate more safe circumstances. But yeah, even so.
Even so. And like you said, there are so many jobs that people do literally risk their lives in a very, very real way. Thinking about like carpenters, like you could just saw off a finger really easily.
Yeah, construction workers. Yeah, you're around heavy equipment. And I'm even thinking like, some people argue that just the amount of psychological and emotional labor that would go into being a sex worker so that you could set boundaries and you could protect yourself, all of that is just like too much. But I'm thinking about my sister who's a nurse who has to work in a hospital, and she's had people literally die in front of her as she's trying to save their lives, and the emotional and psychological toll that takes on a person. And no one questions that. So I think that, like, again, there is this sort of paternalistic idea that people have that, like, we have to protect women from the psychological and emotional toll that sex work would would put upon them. But we don't protect nurses from doing, like, I don't know. Like,
The argument that we have to protect women when there's so little done to actually protect workers in general, you know, like you're pointing to, you know, all the various occupational hazards that people endure and experience every single day at their various workplaces, often for a lot less money than a sex worker is going to make. I just don't buy arguments that are about protecting women when we don't put the same energy into protecting workers. You know, at the end of the day, there are people who profit off of exploitation, and it's not unique to sex work. It's something that's endemic to basically every industry across the board. Is if you know, if safety can be undercut for profit, it's going to happen. And I think that at the end of the day, this is really just about continuing to control women's sexuality and what we do with our bodies, because we know that our autonomy as women is under attack, and what we choose to do is, you know, continuously surveilled and monitored and controlled. And I think that there are reasons for that. And yeah, I just want to see people put that same energy around protecting women into reducing harm across the board, because that's what we're advocating as, you know, people in the sex worker rights movement. You're never going to eliminate this industry. All those attempts to eliminate sex work really just amount to eliminating sex workers, which is frankly a genocidal instinct. People just want to see us die off, and they want to make it easier for us to die, and they want to make it easier for us to be murdered and harmed. And that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong.
we've talked a lot about what it's required to clock in. What about clocking out? Because again, like, as we established, sex work is not unique in that it has a physical toll, it has an emotional toll. Do you bring, like, I'm thinking about how, like, my sister will come home and give me a call after, you know, one of her crazy things that happened at the hospital, and she's just like processing it and downloading it and talks to me about it. Do you talk to your boyfriend about it? Like, what do you know, like, is it like, do you feel like you can, when you clock out, that you can, you know, process and equalize in the aftermath? Like, what does clocking off look like for you?
Yeah, I think clocking out is important, and a really big part of that for sex workers is being in community with one another and being able to talk to each other about our work and decompressing together, and being able to share our stories privately with one another in safe places where we can be ourselves without people making stigmatizing assumptions about who we are and what we do. And so those conversations take place in private among people who understand. And that's where, you know, that's where we can find connection with one another and know that we're not alone. that what we're experiencing, you know, may not be unique, you know, to us, even though it might feel like that in the moment, so that other sex workers can be able to say, hey, I totally understand. You know, sometimes that's a really important part of decompressing and processing a situation is being able to talk to someone who actually understands. And that's why sex worker community is really important. And yeah, I am very, very fortunate that I have a partner that I can talk to about my work without fear that he's going to say, well, if you didn't want that to happen to you, why are you a sex worker? You know, if you didn't want that to happen to you, then why were you there? You know, what that essentially, you know, that same old victim blame that we're so familiar with as women. If you didn't want to be assaulted, why were you wearing that? You know, and that's something that sex workers experience in many realms of our life. You know, even if we get access to therapy and our therapist is not, you know, sex worker informed or trained, we might assume that all of that person's problems is related or are related to sex work, when we're full human beings outside of our occupations. You know, not all of our traumas come from sex work. In fact, a lot of them come outside of sex work. And sex work is what allows us to be able to afford therapy. But that's something, that type of discrimination and those assumptions are something that we encounter in lots of professional settings, unfortunately, because a lot of people just don't even realize the prejudices and the stigmas that they hold within themselves when they interact with us. And so the only safe place and the safe people that we have are each other, are other sex workers. And, you know, that's something that I really try to instill in the film is the importance of sex worker community.
Well, yeah, I mean, in this, and I think that that's true of any service industry. Again, like it makes you only know what's fair, what's right, like by comparing your experience as a service provider to other people who provide service. And in other industries like restaurant industries or lawn care industries, like you're working side by side with people. So on a daily basis, you're seeing what's going on and what's normal, what's not normal. And you can openly talk about it. But like in the sex worker industry, especially due to decriminalization, it's much harder to find community and connection and to make those kinds of assessments alongside each other.
Yeah, and when you consider the fact that we, as sex workers, were continuously displaced off of online social platforms, for instance, thanks to the passing of Sesta Fossa in the US, which makes it, you know, impossible for sex workers to kind of openly be ourselves online without, you know, having our accounts deleted, you know, our entire livelihoods decimated and our social groups, you know, dismantled by virtue of the fact simply that we are sex workers. And so, you know, it's not safe to be a sex worker online, and we continuously migrate from one platform to another, looking for safety, looking for a place where we can be ourselves and build community. But there are, you know, these active attempts to destroy sex worker communities by virtue of the fact that they save our lives. They're so essential and foundational in creating safety and reducing harm. But, you know, it's you know, against the terms of service of many social platforms for us to talk about our work and our strategies for safety.
As someone who's been in the industry for a while, what are your thoughts upon how age intersects with all of this discussion? Because and not just the sort of 18 and over kind of vibe, but like especially in the criminal justice world, where we're highly aware that there's this weird little period in a person's life between the age of like 15 and 25 when you're transitioning from a child to a fully like mentally developed adult. And in that time period, you turn technically legally from a child to an adult, but like psychologically, you're not really all there. And all sorts of havoc is it happens in that time period. 15 to 25 is a time of social and psychological and emotional chaos in a person's life, especially because that is the time period when you're forming yourself as a sexual being. What are your thoughts on both consumers and providers alike on how the sex industry plays a role in that?
I mean, I don't know how much of a role sex work plays in the chaos of, womanhood from 18 to 25, but I will say that.
Or manhood as well,
Or
right?
man, yeah. I work with a lot of women who are under the age of 25 at my strip club, and they are some of the smartest, most brilliant young women I've ever met. Like when I think that there's like 10 years between us, I think I look at them and I'm like, they're way smarter than I was when I was that age. I wish I was I wish I was here when I was 21 and working as an agency escort. I would have made a lot more money at the strip club than I was making as an agency escort doing full service. So I admire them. I think that a lot of them are saving. They're saving their money, and they work hard, and they squirrel that money away. They have dreams of buying property and going back to school and really making something of their lives, because they understand that like this job is not forever necessarily. Granted, I do work with a lot of women who are in their 40s and in their 50s at the strip club. I've worked with grandmothers. I've worked with all kinds of people who are much older, than 25 years old. I think it's a bit of a stereotype that the sex industry is a young woman's game or a young person's game. In fact, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting people who have been in the sex industry their entire lives, into their 80s, still in the industry, performing different types of labor, being paid handsomely for their work, and people who understand that because the umbrella of sex work is so wide, they don't have to be doing, the stripping or the full service even into their 60s and their 70s or their 80s. There are so many other roles that can be performed within the industry, even supporting roles, that create fulfillment and are enjoyable and also support other people in the industry. A lot of people get into this work and they don't leave it because they love the freedom, they love the sexual liberation of it all, and they love the money. And as mentioned before, there are relationships that develop between providers and their clientele that can last the duration of both of their lives. We hear about like clients passing away and sex workers being at their funerals or being in their wills, being like we are meaningful members of our society and of our clients' lives, and you could be any age and perform some role in the industry of sexual labor and have a very happy and well remunerated life.
Yeah. I'm just thinking even that like I've absolutely become friends with some of the people who are my subscribers and patrons, and it's like, well, does the fact that they still like pay money to my Patreon mean that we're not really friends? Like I don't think so. Anyway, so all really like great I think like what was really so great about your documentary was not only was it just a hoot to watch, it was just a freaking like fun times. Like, just of all like things that I've ever seen about the sex industry, it was just so palatable and like so innovative and so fun. So I had a ton of fun watching it, but it also like really encouraged me to like think through intuitive feelings that I felt, and to like go back to my base philosophical principles to ask myself, what is intrinsically true about this thing, as opposed to what I think and feel about it. Like, what do I know to be true, and how does that compare to anything else that I know to be true? And I thought that was a really great exercise. So thank you for inspiring that. What are you working on next? What's ahead for you?
Well, I mean, Modern Horror, our feature film, is currently doing the film festival circuit. So it's traveling around, but it will be, in wide release in 2026. So everyone will be able to see it in the new year, which is really exciting. So a lot of my time and energy will be dedicated to that, but I'm writing. And I also started my own Substack a couple months ago.
All
And
right.
I'm loving it. I am loving Substack. I'm hoping to kind of migrate more permanently as my primary um, platform. I'm just really grateful for being able to write and be paid for it, which is kind of my dream. Sex work
Right.
is the job. I just like to be paid to write.
Yeah, talk about the number of people who are not paid to write as well. All this free labor we're all doing. God damn it.
It's over. It's over. Let's get paid.
All right. On that note, I will thank you very much for being on Hard Knocks.
Thank you so much.